best way to make our schools safer and prevent a tragedy like we saw in Parkland. Part of that path is a comprehensive threat assessment and management as a follow-up. The U.S. Secret Service has championed prevention more than any other federal agency. This new report builds on over 20 years of study at NTAC. They have used a unique blend of operationally relevant and behavior-based research as they connect the data from past attacks and develop guidelines to aid in preventing future tragedy. To quote the report, "It is critical that student threat assessments be multidisciplinary and focused on providing robust interventions to students assessed as posing any level of risk to themselves or others." In the dark days following the murder of our children, when Ryan began his search for answers, it was then that he discovered NTAC and their mission to prevent targeted attacks. He was immediately drawn to what he learned and deeply saddened that no one had used the insights to prevent the attack that killed our children. As Max began his mission to make our nation's schools safer, he networked with many others who shared that goal. He heard about NTAC and its mission from Susan Payne at Safe to Tell. He was then amazed by Dr. Alathari when she testified before the commission investigating the Parkland tragedy. As for myself, I was fortunate enough to attend a presentation regarding NTAC earlier this year. I quickly came to the realization that had the tools developed by NTAC been used properly, my lovely daughter and 16 other wonderful souls taken in the Parkland massacre might still be here today. Our entire community would be whole instead of forever shaken. We have come to Washington many times to speak with our elected leaders about a need for change. In March of 2018, we met with Senator Grassley, then the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, who had introduced the Eagles Act, as we heard, named after the mascot at Stoneman Douglas High School. This bill provides for vital funding for NTAC and the great work they do to protect America's leaders, schools, and public spaces. Before you read this report, we ask that you remember the one thing that all the communities in this study had in common, and that was a shared belief that it could not happen to them. Please, learn from our experience. It happened to us, and it can happen to your community too. That's why we support the work of NTAC and their important efforts to improve school safety. That's why we call on Congress to unite and support the Eagles Act. And finally, Stand with Parkland reminds everyone that targeted violence in our nation's schools is an American problem, and we must all come together to find solutions that keep our students and teachers safe. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Welcome, Director, and thank you, Max, Ryan, Tony, Susan, and Peter for being here. I'm going to go over some of the findings of the report. I know it was just released recently to get you familiar with some of the data and the facts that we've discovered. So I'm going to start off by talking a little bit about the center and who we are. So it's the Secret Service National Threat Assessment Center. We have been around for 20 years at least. We were founded in 2000 through the Presidential Threat Protection Act. It's actually a congressional authorization for our mission. The staff of NTAC, they're all here today. They've worked tirelessly on this report. We are ourselves very multidisciplinary. We're all researchers, but we come from a variety of backgrounds so that this research is best informed. We have criminal psychologists, clinical psychologists, social workers, former uniform division, former probation officers, all researchers, so that we can have a robust research program that draws from the different disciplines. This is what our mission is. Our congressionally authorized mission is to do research on preventing all types of targeted violence, including attacks against government, mass attacks, school attacks, as well as workplace violence and other targeted attacks. Our second mission is to translate our research operationally so that we can go out and do trainings to inform the public of what are the facts related to these cases and the best avenues for prevention. Our third mission, which is just as important, is the consultation mission. So we actually provide guidance to agencies that are building threat assessment programs, as well as ones that might have individuals of concern, whether it's in a school or a police department might be concerned about someone in the community. Essentially, we provide guidance on how to identify, assess, and manage the same way that the Secret Service uses this model to protect our elected leaders. These are some of the reports that we've published. I'm not going to go into them in detail. They're all publicly available on the secretservice.gov website. As you see, we have a variety of different types of research studies. We've been doing an annual report on mass attacks, looking at areas and interventions from a threat assessment perspective on how to prevent them. Last year, we released a school safety guide, which I'll talk about. That guide was mass-produced and shipped to 40,000 schools nationwide, and it provides actionable steps that schools can take to prevent attacks. What I'm going to talk about today is protecting America's school. We started this research study about a year and a half ago, maybe more than that. It was actually, we started planning the study February 15th, 2018. And we finished it this week, and this is the rollout that we're doing today. The study examined 41 targeted attacks of school violence in which a current student or a recently former student who had been within the school system for the last year carried out an intentional attack against the school in which at least one school member was injured, whether it's a student, a staff, or someone else at the school. Most of these attacks occurred, all of these attacks occurred on school property. There was one that was after hours, but it was actually a prom that was being held at the school. The reason this is a most comprehensive, in-depth study of school attacks is because that through our network of Secret Service field offices around the country and our law enforcement partners, we were able to get all the police records, investigative files, sort of the non-public records on these attacks. So we really had a lot of robust information for each incident that we identified as part of this project. We did an in-depth dive, as we usually do in all of our reports. We look at the backgrounds of the offenders, as much information, basically, essentially, retracing their life up until the moment of attack, so we can identify behavior, circumstances, and other triggers that may have led them to consider violence as an option. In addition to the backgrounds, we always look at the tactics, the methods, school security implications. You will see that in the report in terms of looking at the school characteristics, what security measures they had in place, the ratio of student to teachers, and so on. We look at the tactics that the attackers used, whether there was any planning, and I'll talk a little bit about some of the deep dive elements. These are just some of the variables that we looked at. There are many more in the report, but this is just to highlight some of the findings. On average, the school attacker age was 15, so they varied. The youngest was 12, the oldest was 18. You can tell that the majority were male. There were 34 males, but however, we also had 7 females that carried out an act of targeted school violence. You can see that the age of the attacker also, the grade level of the attacker also varied. There really is no sort of accurate or useful profile as to the type of students because they are from different grades, different age groups, and different backgrounds and different factors in their backgrounds. However, we do identify commonalities in their behaviors and circumstances that we can use to prevent these types of incidents, and this is what we will be focused on for the remainder of talking about the backgrounds of the offenders. Most of the attackers used firearms, so there were, you can see the percentage there. There were 16 incidents that were bladed weapons. There were 25 firearm incidents, 16 bladed weapons for the firearms. There were 18 handguns and 9 rifles that were used. Most of these attacks frequently took place, I should say, after a break in school attendance. So that is at the start of a school year or coming back from winter break or even if a student had been suspended and coming back from a suspension. In fact, in one attack, the student was actually actively suspended at the time of when the attack occurred. So this is an interesting finding. We had not seen that. It's been a variable that had not been looked at before. So that it looks at the timing of when these attacks are occurring. As we see in all of our research, this is not a surprising finding. The majority of these attacks end in under 2 minutes. A lot of them end in under 1 minute. That obviously has implications for response and security. The longest attack lasted about 8 to 10 minutes, but that was sort of rare that happened. 3/4 were immediately before school began, so before the first bell, and during morning class hours. So that's the timing of when they most frequently occurred. But there were other incidents, of course, that occurred throughout the day. This is just sort of what the most frequent had happened. In terms of, I already talked about that, so unless you wanted to see that, but I just talked about that. We can go back to that slide. In terms of targeting and motive, nearly all attackers, except in fact all but 2, had a primary motive that contributed to their decision to carry out this attack. However, majority of other attackers also had a secondary motive. What that essentially means is there is not one motive. There's usually a main motive, but they have different motives for why they carry out these types of attacks. So if you can look, the most frequent motive, the most prominent or predominant motive is a grievance. And that grievance is usually with a peer at the school. It's with a staff member at the school. It could be due to a romantic relationship, for example, a breakup, or it was related to some personal issue. There was one attacker who thought he was going to be kicked off the wrestling team because he had failed a drug test, for example. That was the most common motive. As I said, in a majority of these attacks, there's also a secondary motive. You see that the second most prevalent motive was related to a desire to kill, in which the student was posting, talking about, and journaling about deriving joy from violence, wanting to commit an act of violence, excited about committing an act of violence. That was the second most prevalent motive. And in fact, we found that the attackers that were motivated by a desire to kill most often, in fact, in nearly all, targeted random victims as opposed to specific victims. Even though the majority of the report, nearly 3/4 of the attackers, had targeted a specific person at the school, a classmate that may have had a grievance with, a staff member that they were angry at, or just generally a grievance with someone at the school. Nearly half of the grievances were related to bullying. So they were retaliating for experiencing bullying. That was a major component of what the grievances were about, in addition to some of these other personal issues that we talked about. For the next few slides, I'm going to talk about some of the elements, and these are what we call, if you look at the Enhancing School Safety Guide that we released last year, these elements should be guiding how an investigation is conducted. It's the same way that the Secret Service conducts investigations. We want to look at the behaviors, the backgrounds, have these students had law enforcement contact, are there any psychological issues at play that may have contributed to their decision to carry out an attack? We look at some of their home life factors, stressors, and so on. So I'll go into detail about some of these. In terms of the mental health findings, we divided sort of the symptoms that we found in these records into 3 main categories: psychological, behavioral, and neurodevelopmental. The most frequent combination of symptoms to occur together were psychological and behavioral. The most common psychological symptoms that you will see in the report are depressive symptoms and suicidal ideation. In terms of the behavioral symptoms, this usually ranged from having defiance with authority, misconduct, poor impulse control, usually symptoms that are associated with behavioral or conduct issues. And then the neurodevelopmental symptoms included things like cognitive delays, developmental delays, poor interaction, maybe someone who might be on the autism spectrum having learning disabilities and so on. There were only 7 attackers that had that. But predominantly the most common symptoms were the psychological symptoms and the behavioral symptoms, the psychological most common, and then a combination of both. Half of the attackers had a history of substance use that bordered to the, at times, bordered to the point of abuse, in which it caused significant negative impacts in their lives, whether it was legal problems, disciplinary actions at school, or other detrimental effects. The most commonly found substances that were used and abused by these attackers were alcohol and marijuana. However, we did also find that several attackers had used amphetamines and other controlled substances, abused over-the-counter medication. One attacker was self-medicating, where prior to the attack, for about a 1 year to 2 year period, he was drinking a bottle of cough medicine laced with codeine every 2 days as a way of sort of self-medicating and dealing with family issues, which is what he had said after his attack. Other things that we were looking at, and this is an in-depth variable that actually had not been looked at in such detail before. A lot of these variables that we identified, we categorized along several factors. So home life factors was a pretty significant variable, and it's usually not just one. On average, these attackers experienced more than one of these home life factors, and all but 2 of the attackers experienced at least one. And these are included family issues in the home. Looking at financial difficulty that the parents were experiencing, maybe divorce and separation. The parents may have been incarcerated, or another family member may have been incarcerated or have legal. The report actually details.
You guys, it's still going.
It went back to set here?
We're on the set.
Yes, okay.
Every single attacker experienced a social stressor, and a social stressor was usually related to peers and social situations, whether it was romantic, bullying, conflict with peers, interpersonal conflicts with other classmates, and so on. So that was the most common stressor. Nearly all within 6 months, as we said, 3/4 within 1 month, half within 2. Attackers usually experience at least 2 of these 8 categories of stressors. And some of the other categories included, as we talked about, maybe family issues in the home that impacted the attacker, academic disciplinary problems, whether they were failing a class or had been suspended or issued some other disciplinary action against them, some other general personal issues that may have impacted the attacker. Changing schools. This variable was actually unrelated to a normal change and transition from middle to high school. Changing schools included moving to a new community and starting a new school, being suspended and coming back from suspension, basically where there was, being expelled and then going to a different school. So it involved changing actual schools, not normally in transition. Criminal justice and arrest and charges, we'll talk about that in a little bit, but some of these attackers had these ongoing issues going where they had been arrested before or charged criminally, and physical health, and as well as some employment issues. The employment issues normally we see more in the adult population, but several of these attackers actually had jobs and they had employment issues related to those jobs, stressors. Bullying was one of the most common stressors that we saw. Most of the attackers experienced bullying. There were several types of bullying that were experienced by the attackers. We defined it in these categories. So verbal bullying was the most common bullying that was experienced by the attackers. That included being called names, teased, threatened, and by their peers. The most common location where the bullying occurred was at the school. And so I believe about 26 attackers had been verbally bullied, and a majority of that occurred at the school. They also experienced physical bullying. So that included assaults, someone hitting, punching them. Property included, is when you had other students spreading rumors about them, ostracizing them. One attacker, when he would go sit at a table, let's say in the cafeteria, other students would get up and leave on purpose. That was a form of social bullying. Property bullying, that's when attackers had their money stolen, they had their property vandalized. And then, of course, cyberbullying. We actually found a lot more frequent incidents of verbal bullying than we did cyberbullying. But cyberbullying basically, essentially, is bullying that occurred online or by text messages. In 3 cases, the attackers noted that they were bullied. However, we found no evidence of that. This is why it's important for us when we're collecting information to look at the perception that that student has of whether they're bullied or not. And actually, that same thing applies for stressors. Some stressors may be common. Some kids might have a positive coping mechanism of dealing with stressors, but also it's the perception of that stress and how it impacted that person. About 1/3 of the attackers were actually bullies themselves, in that they bullied other people. Most often that was response to some of the other bullying or some other conflicts they've had. Concerning behaviors included actions that the attackers did, as well as what they communicated. So any behavior that the attacker exhibited. Every single attacker in this report exhibited concerning behavior. For many of them, that behavior actually elicited safety concerns in those around them. The majority of these behaviors were visible and observed by those around them. The categories of behaviors we kind of categorize in 2 different buckets. One that were objectively concerning, and that includes behaviors that should immediately, for example, trigger an intervention or an assessment. That includes bringing a weapon to school, physical violence, intimidation, threats of committing violence. And then we also encourage, and because we find this in our research a lot, that we need to be paying attention to these lower level constellation of concerning behaviors. Those may include dramatic or sudden changes in mood, behavior, appearance, increased conflicts with peers, more depressive symptoms, social isolation. Those are all behaviors that we found in the backgrounds of these attackers. A lot of them displayed between at least 2 of 8 categories of these concerning behaviors. These are the top 10 themes of the concerning behaviors exhibited by the attackers in this report. And they're the most frequent one that we found in this more prevalent one in the report was threat to the target or others and intent to commit an act of violence at the school. So these attackers were making their intentions known that they were going to target the school or a person at the school or staff at the school for an attack. And they had also previously made threats against their intended target. Intense or escalating anger, outbursts, conflicts, fights, interest in weapons, and that is like an unusual interest in weapons where they were posting about it, communicating about it, fixated on weapons, sadness, depression, isolation, changes in behavior or appearance, as I said. This is all included in the Protecting America's Schools report, but these are the most 10 sort of common categories that we found that was observable to those around the attackers. In terms of their communications as a subcomponent of the concerning behavior, as I said, most had threatened their targets or made their intention known that they were going to carry out an attack. 2/3 did so within 2 weeks, and half within 2 days of their attack. They were talking about it in person, posting. 2/3 gave some level of imminence to the attack, meaning that I'm going to come to school tomorrow or nobody better stop me tomorrow, that type of thing. These are the most common ways that others were aware of these communications, so the attacker shared their communications with others. The majority of the time it was verbally to other students at the school. But you also had electronic messages to other people. They posted and turned in online posting online, but also turned in school assignments that had violent themes and threats and intents to attack, and also by phone. The responses to the concerning behaviors varied. As I said, most of these behaviors were observable to those around them in the school community, within the home, and in the community. So as you can see, in less than half of these cases, adults received information about what a person had observed, whether it was a student reporting this information to an adult, and in less than a quarter, classmates told a parents or a school staff member, and in less than half, adults talk to each other. So a teacher may be sharing her concerns about a student in her class in which she observed this behavior, sharing that with another teacher at the school. You can see the spectrum of the responses. In less than half, was there any significant response to a prohibitedly, objectively concerning prohibited behavior? Significant responses would have included calling the police, suspension, or taking some immediate significant action. These are the various, range from no response to a particular concerning behavior that an attacker may have exhibited to avoiding the person actively because of their concern about their behavior, students talking to other students about their concern, someone actually approaching the attacker and engaging them to ask about this concerning behavior, peers talking to adults, so the student would be talking to adult, all the way up to significant responses such as a suspension or taking other drastic measures to make sure that that person is, there's an intervention for that particular behavior. These are some of the reasons we looked at as to why maybe those around the individual did not respond immediately, especially if there was a threat of conducting a school attack or a threat against another peer at the school or talking about weapons or posting about it, or even the lower level threshold constellation of concerning behaviors. Some of them thought they were joking and that it was not, or that it was the usual. He always talks about these kind of things, that type of thing, or she always mentions these things. They believe that they helped the person. So in some cases, let's say the attacker is exhibiting depressed behavior or suicidal symptoms, the person, a student or a teacher or someone approaches them, they think that they've actually helped them, and then that person maybe is better and is no longer concerning, so sort of misjudging that effect of the intervention, intended to try, but the attack happened before they could, so they wanted to intervene in the concerning behavior, but it was too late, because the attack had already happened. They did not think it would happen at the school, so they thought, okay, well, he's talking about violence, but I don't think he would actually ever come and do it at the school, or she would do that. Or they assumed that an administrator who knew would take action, so sort of that who's responsible for acting on this information. In terms of implications for the study, a lot of these findings that we wrote about and outlined in Protecting America's Schools really have a lot of implications for community safety efforts. So they are outlined in the report, but I'll go through some of them. As I said, attackers usually had multiple motives. It was never just one motive. Most often it was related to grievances, and most of the grievances were, majority of the grievances most often were related to bullying. Most attackers had used firearms in the past. They'd had, for example, training, interest in them for things that may not be indicative of violence. For example, being with ROTC, going hunting and shooting, and so on. So most of them had used weapons before, and most attackers used firearms in the report, and they most often were able to secure those firearms, acquire those firearms from the home. In a lot of those cases, the firearm was not secured, or not secured in a meaningful way. Most had experienced, as I said, psychological symptoms. It's important to note, however, that a lot of times signs and symptoms that may be indicative of a psychological, or showing that a psychological symptom may not be really as a result of a psychiatric disorder. It could be part of the underlying situational factors that these kids are experiencing. For example, stressors in the home that may make them depressed or may make them suicidal. So because they had these symptoms that we collected information on these observable behaviors, didn't necessarily indicate that this was a symptom of a diagnosed problem. Although I think about 40% of the attackers had actually received mental health treatment in the study. Half of the attackers had interest in violent topics, and that is a unusual interest, persistent. They posted about, for example, the Columbine attacks. They posted about other school shootings. They posted themes. They turned in assignments. They talked about it to those around them. All attackers had experienced social stressors, and as I said, nearly every attacker experienced some negative home life factor in their experiences growing up. Most were victims of bullying, had history of school disciplinary actions, and many had prior contact with law enforcement, that is actually an unusual finding from previous research, is that half, I believe, had a history of violence, and many had contact with law enforcement as a result of maybe arrests, criminal charges, but also there were others who had contact with law enforcement because law enforcement may have been called out to the home for an unrelated issue. All attackers exhibited concerning behavior, as we said, and most elicited concern about their communications and their behaviors. So what does this mean for the next steps, and what can the community do with with the findings in this report? These findings highlight what we've known for 20 years, that a lot of these attacks are preventable if there's appropriate protocols in place to be able to identify students who may be in distress or engaging in concerning behavior, gather information, and identify information from multiple corroborative sources, whether it's the parents, it's the other students at the school, it's the teachers that know them and see them every day, to gather information on the behavioral themes that we identified, the situational factors, home life factors, and so on. Once that information is gathered, then we need to assess and intervene and come up with protocols. If we had a multidisciplinary, comprehensive threat assessment program in place that starts as outlined in the Enhancing School Safety Guide that the Secret Service released last July, we will know that we need to provide these schools with actionable steps, such as establishing multidisciplinary, highly trained team members, defining the concerning behaviors and the prohibited behaviors in the target violence prevention plans that are enacted in schools, making sure that there's a reporting mechanism where kids are empowered to report, teachers can report this information, and doing training on that so people know what to look for, how to report information, how to identify intervention points, determining a threshold of when to have law enforcement involved. Law enforcement is not going to be involved in every assessment at the school, but there are instances where they can help and they should be involved, especially if there's an imminent risk of safety. And implementing procedures that outline the protocols that school personnel who are tasked with conducting the threat assessment to carry out a comprehensive assessment to make sure that a situation is not prone to violence. So thank you, and I take Kathy.
Thank you, Dr. Alathari. We'll now proceed to the Q&A portion. So I've got a microphone here. If you will just identify your name and your outlet, and Dr. Alathari is happy to answer any questions on the National Threat Assessment Center, the report, and any of the findings. So. Thank you.
Thank you. Nathan Baca, WSA 9. Often after a school shooting, there is talk about violent video games, about whether or not they were a factor in some sort of negative influence. Did your study look into these video games, and if so, what did it find?
So as I said earlier about the variable and looking at interest in violence, we did find that many of these attackers had interest in violence, not necessarily just video games, so it wasn't isolated to just that. They viewed graphic media, they viewed documentaries, they looked at movies, they read books about with violent interest, so not necessarily isolated to just video games, but graphic video internet content. We did see that in the background of these attackers in terms of their fixated and interest in violence.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Kevin Johnson with USA Today. One of the more striking stats was the number for no response and avoidance, I guess both of those. And in many of the schools, at least according to my reading of the report, they had these threat assessment teams in place, although the training varied and such. But given those numbers and the fact that you do have physical security and threat assessment teams in place, what does it take now to push that group of people, some 86% who either elect not to respond or avoid, to do something?
So, Peter, not every school had, when we talk about the assessment part in the report, that was actually not all threat assessment teams. So in several schools, they had assessment protocols, but that wasn't necessarily threat assessment. Does that make sense? So they had maybe assessment where a team might intervene with a student who's declining in grades or academic, but it was not a formal threat assessment program where they would have been trained on actually conducting a threat assessment. In this report, there were only 4 cases that we identified in which a threat assessment was conducted. And in those cases, there were some challenges and information gaps to the way those threat assessments were conducted. But just that, again, to answer your question, that not many of the schools actually had threat assessment protocols. They had some sort of assessment where they may have a teacher assigned or a counselor assigned to assess a student for a variety of behaviors, but is not a formal threat assessment program, and they had not been trained on threat assessment.
Luke Barr with ABC News. The report talks about the fact that external police response haven't stopped any of these incidents. Does the report sort of indicate a shift in law enforcement from prevention to a response to a prevention model?
So when we're at training, so we do a lot of training for law enforcement, and as you said in the report, not one single attack was stopped by a responding law enforcement officer. In fact, the 6 incidents, 6 of the attacks, there was a law enforcement response that stopped them. 5 of those were SROs that were already at the school. The 6th incident was by a local police officer, but he was actually at the school doing drug sweeps at the prom. And that's why he was there. So not one attack, and that was a pretty crucial finding, that not one attack was stopped by responding law enforcement. But if you look at how fast these incidents happen, the majority of these incidents ended in under 2 minutes. So it would be practically impossible for a responding police to respond and end that incident. In terms of the shift now, as you said, in thinking, this is why we at the Secret Service really advocate threat assessment and prevention as a best practice. Last July, we released a report on mass attacks, and we held an event in D.C. For over 600 state and local law enforcement and others. And one of the main comments that we got after was that there needs to be a shift. That police, I got these comments from police